Imagine a young, handsome, and charismatic man, admired by everyone around him, with a bright future ahead. This was Absalom, the son of the powerful King David, known both for his striking appearance and the respect he commanded among the people of Israel. But behind this public image of perfection lay a story of pain, betrayal, and ambition that would lead to ruin. In a journey full of dramatic twists, Absalom went from being the favored son to a rebel, ready to overthrow his own father. Absalom's tragedy begins like many stories of conflict, with resentment and silence. What happens when the desire for justice turns into hatred and the pursuit of power leads to destruction? Absalom's life teaches profound lessons about the dangers of pride, bitterness, and unchecked ambition. In the midst of a devastating family confrontation, we see how far someone is willing to go to achieve what they desire, even if the price is the love of their family. In this story, you will witness not only a political rebellion but a family tragedy. The young man who could have inherited the throne of Israel chose instead to challenge his own father, King David. But did he truly understand the consequences of his actions? Get ready to explore the rise and fall of Absalom, the prince who dared to rebel against God's chosen one. Absalom, David's third son, was the kind of prince people admired. He was known for his impressive appearance and charisma, which made him a favorite not only of the people but also within the royal family. His hair, especially, was legendary, so thick that he would cut it once a year and weigh what had been removed. But behind this perfect image was an ambition that would slowly reveal itself as tragic. Absalom wasn't just outwardly handsome. He had a strong personality marked by pride and determination. From a young age, Absalom showed signs of a restless nature. He was someone who would not accept being treated unfairly, nor would he stand by when he saw injustices without acting. His impulsive temperament was displayed when his half-brother Amnon committed a grave offense against his sister Tamar. David's silence in the face of this situation was the first spark for Absalom's anger. He could not accept that his father, the king, would allow such a crime to go unpunished. This planted seeds of bitterness and resentment in his heart. For 2 years, Absalom kept his hatred for Amnon secret, plotting his revenge. He invited his brothers to a banquet, and during the event, he ordered his servants to kill Amnon. It was a calculated, cold strike carried out without mercy. In that moment, Absalom not only avenged himself but also made a statement about who he truly was. A man who wouldn't leave his enemies unanswered, even if it meant shedding his own blood. However, this action put him in a dangerous position. After the murder, Absalom fled to Geshur, where his mother's family had roots. There, he remained for 3 years, exiled from his homeland and from his father. Even in exile, the flame of his ambition only grew. He dreamed of more than just revenge. He dreamed of power, and this desire would shape the next years of his life. The bond between father and son was broken, and the chasm between them only widened with time. The physical distance from David didn't erase Absalom's resentment, but it also didn't diminish David's love for his son. Although hurt by Absalom's actions, David longed for his return. However, reconciliation between them was far from simple. Absalom, now a grown man, would return not just as the prodigal son, but as someone whose heart had been hardened by anger and ambition. Behind Absalom's smile and imposing posture was a growing desire for something more. He didn't want to be just a prince. He wanted the throne, his father's throne. And for that, he was willing to play a dangerous game, one that would eventually cost everyone much more than they imagined. The event that set Absalom on a path of vengeance began unexpectedly, within the very walls of the palace. Tamar, his sister, was known for her beauty and grace, someone Absalom always protected with deep affection. However, Amnon, his half-brother and David's eldest son, developed a dangerous obsession with Tamar. What began as desire quickly turned into a terrible tragedy. Amnon, taking advantage of his position and manipulating those around him, lured Tamar into his chambers under the pretense of asking her to care for him while he was ill. But when she arrived, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Tamar, innocent and unprepared, was brutally assaulted by Amnon. What followed was even more devastating. Instead of dealing with the guilt of his actions, Amnon despised her and ordered her to leave, destroying not only her dignity but also any hope of justice for Tamar. When Absalom learned of what had happened, his reaction was a mix of fury and despair. Tamar was his blood sister, and the idea that someone had dishonored her, especially a member of their own family, was a wound he could never overcome. Absalom advised Tamar to remain in his house and took care of her, but internally, he vowed that this offense would not go unpunished. Absalom's outrage only grew when he realized that his father, King David, was reluctant to act decisively against Amnon. David, always emotionally divided, loved both Amnon and Absalom, which left him paralyzed in the situation. He was furious about the crime but hesitated to impose any significant punishment on his eldest son. This inaction bothered Absalom the most. To him, the lack of justice was a betrayal both to Tamar and to the honor of the family. David's silence fueled a dangerous fire in Absalom's heart. For 2 years, Absalom waited patiently, keeping his anger under control. He didn't show his intention for revenge but knew that his time would come. During this time, he planned every detail of his retaliation against Amnon. There would be no escape, and he would take justice into his own hands, which his father had refused to do. Finally, the opportunity arose at a banquet that Absalom organized for his brothers. He invited Amnon, and during the feast, ordered his servants to kill his half-brother. The blow was quick and deadly, a cold execution of his revenge. With this act, Absalom not only avenged Tamar but also made a bold declaration. He was a man who demanded justice, even if it had to be stained with blood. This event was the final break between Absalom and David. After Amnon's death, Absalom fled to Geshur, where he would remain in exile for 3 long years. And though he was far away, his determination and ambition only grew, leading him to plan his next move. He was no longer just the avenger of his sister, but a man seeking something much greater, the throne of Israel. After Amnon's murder, Absalom fled to the land of Geshur, his maternal grandparents' home. This exile would last for 3 years, during which Absalom distanced himself both from his family and his homeland. Geshur offered Absalom a safe haven, far from the wrath of King David and the consequences of his act. But to him, exile was more of an emotional prison than a physical one. He longed to return to Jerusalem and reclaim his place, not only as a prince but as a legitimate heir to the throne. During his time in Geshur, Absalom began to solidify his ideas of greatness. The distance from his father and Jerusalem only intensified his desire for power. The rebellion against David, although not yet declared, was being planned in his heart. Absalom knew that if he returned to Jerusalem, he would need more than forgiveness. He would need a strategy. And part of that strategy involved winning the people's support. But for that to happen, he had to leave exile. Joab, David's army commander and close advisor, noticed that David still harbored love for Absalom despite everything. Believing it was time for reconciliation, Joab began plotting Absalom's return. With the help of a wise woman from Tekoa, Joab managed to convince David to bring his son back. However, this reconciliation was far from complete. David allowed Absalom to return, but for 2 years, he refused to see him personally. This incomplete return was like adding fuel to the fire of Absalom's anger. He was physically in Jerusalem, but still distant from his father's heart and the throne he so coveted. During this period, he began to plan the next phase of his rise to power. He knew that to achieve his goals, he would need to win the people's favor. And Absalom, with his beauty and charisma, knew exactly how to do that. It was then that Absalom began to implement a strategy to win popular support. He spent hours at the city gates, where legal disputes were settled, listening to people's complaints and promising justice for all. He would say, "If only I were judge in Israel, everyone would have their cases heard fairly." His words resonated in the hearts of the people, and soon, many began to see Absalom as the leader they needed, someone who cared about their struggles and the injustices they faced. If you're enjoying this story so far, comment the word justice below. I have a special message for you at the end. Over time, Absalom began to gather followers, people who were willing to support him in his eventual rise. He was not just preparing for a confrontation with his father. He was paving the way to take David's throne, even if it meant a full rebellion. When Absalom finally returned to Jerusalem, he knew that his mission was far from over. Although he was back in the city, the return was cold and distant. David allowed him to live there but refused to see him face to face for 2 long years. For Absalom, his father's indifference was like an open wound, fueling his desire to take the throne. He believed that if the king didn't recognize him as a son and heir, he would have to make that recognition himself. During this period of isolation, Absalom began to map out his next steps to claim what he saw as his destiny. The first thing he understood was that he needed popular support. He knew that his father, David, had won the people's hearts through military victories and wise decisions. But Absalom had a different plan: to win the people's hearts through empathy and justice. During this time, Absalom began frequenting the city gates. Daily, he listened to people's complaints and legal disputes. Always with a smile, he promised justice to those who felt King David had ignored them. He would say, "If I were judge in Israel, no one would have to go through this. Everyone would receive the justice they deserve." These words gained traction, and soon Absalom was seen as the defender of the oppressed, someone who genuinely cared about the people's suffering. Little by little, Absalom's number of followers grew. He knew that winning the people's hearts was the first step to taking power. The seeds of rebellion were being planted, but Absalom still had to deal with his father. The coldness between them was unsustainable, and Absalom was not willing to continue being ignored. To him, the only way forward was to force a reconciliation or provoke a reaction from David. Tired of waiting, Absalom finally took drastic action. He set Joab's fields, David's general, on fire to get his attention. Furious, Joab confronted Absalom, who explained that this was the only way to get what he wanted. The strategy worked, and Joab convinced David to allow a meeting between father and son. The meeting between David and Absalom was marked by a moment of public reconciliation. Absalom knelt before his father, and David kissed him, a symbol of forgiveness. But this gesture was only superficial. The public reconciliation didn't erase the resentment that had formed between them. In his heart, Absalom no longer saw David as his father but as an obstacle to the power he believed he deserved. With growing popular support and the evident coldness between him and David, Absalom was ready to take the next step in his rebellion. He knew that time was on his side and that with each passing day, more people aligned themselves with his cause. Absalom knew that gaining the people's support was crucial to his plans. His charisma, striking beauty, and ability to speak directly to the people's hearts made him an appealing figure to many in Israel. While David remained reclusive in his role as king, Absalom became increasingly active at the city gates. There, he made sure to personally hear the people's complaints and problems. With kind gestures and words of encouragement, he gained the trust of those who felt neglected by David's government. His strategy was simple but effective. He placed himself among the people, without guards or any symbols of superiority. Absalom shook hands with those who came to him, listened to their complaints, and always showed solidarity. This set him apart from David, who, as a warrior king, was often distant from the everyday issues. The people began to see Absalom as a leader who genuinely cared about the nation's well-being, someone who understood their struggles and was willing to fight for them. Absalom used this image to strengthen his position. By aligning himself with those who suffered injustices or felt that David's government had distanced itself from the people, he began to gather a loyal group of followers. Many saw him as the just and kind prince, and his actions were steadily laying the groundwork for something bigger. He wasn't just planting seeds of dissatisfaction against David. He was cultivating a personal loyalty that would be extremely useful later. As his support grew, Absalom began to show clearer signs of his ambition. He assembled an escort of 50 men to accompany him wherever he went, suggesting that he was not just an ordinary prince but someone destined for something greater. These public displays of power did not go unnoticed, but Absalom was careful to maintain an image of humility and accessibility to the people. He knew he needed to balance power with the personal touch that made him so popular. With each passing day, Absalom gained more allies. His plan was clear: slowly undermine David's authority by winning popular support and creating a power base that would help him in his future rebellion. He knew he couldn't rush things. Time was on his side, and patience would be his greatest ally. And so, as the months passed, Absalom became not just a veiled threat but a force David would have to reckon with. His power was growing, and many in the kingdom already saw him as Israel's future leader. But Absalom knew that this wouldn't be enough. He would have to take a decisive step if he really wanted to seize the throne. The moment Absalom had been waiting for finally arrived. After years of patience, cultivating the people's support and fueling his desire for power, he decided it was time to act. Absalom's plan was audacious. He wouldn't wait for his father to die to take the throne, but would declare himself king while David was still ruling. This action was a bold move, but Absalom knew that with the support he had garnered, his rebellion had a real chance of success. Absalom began his coup in Hebron, the city where his father had first been crowned king. He knew Hebron held special significance for both him and the people of Israel. Claiming that he was going to the city to fulfill a vow to God, he managed to gather a large crowd of followers and sympathizers. With his smooth words and promises of a better future, he proclaimed himself king in Hebron. The choice of Hebron as the location for the proclamation was symbolic. It was as if he were retracing David's steps but with the intention of replacing him. News of Absalom's self-proclamation as king spread quickly. Many in Israel, dissatisfied with the distance they felt from David, saw in Absalom an opportunity for change. The young prince had charisma, power, and a promise of justice, something many believed David had lost over time. By this point, Absalom had already gathered a considerable force, consisting not only of civilians but also influential men and warriors willing to support him. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, David was caught off guard. The king, now older and weary, hadn't expected his own son to rebel in such a way. When the news reached him, David understood the gravity of the situation. Absalom wasn't just claiming the throne. He was willing to overthrow his own father to achieve it. The speed with which Absalom had gained popular support was impressive, and David knew he faced a difficult battle to maintain the throne. Without wasting time, David made a painful but necessary decision. He would flee Jerusalem. With his loyal entourage, David left the city, crossing the Kidron Valley with tears in his eyes. For the king, this wasn't just a political defeat. It was a personal betrayal by his own son. As he left the city he had ruled for so many years, the weight of personal tragedy and the loss of his kingdom began to bear down on him. Absalom, on the other hand, saw David's flight as a sign of imminent victory. He entered Jerusalem triumphantly, as if he had already conquered the throne. But despite the apparent victory, Absalom still needed to consolidate his power. He knew David wouldn't give up without a fight, and the battle to come would be decisive for Israel's future. When David fled Jerusalem, he found himself in one of the darkest moments of his life. The great king, who had defeated giants and led Israel to countless victories, was now running from his own son. The decision to leave the city wasn't just about survival. It was also an attempt to avoid a bloody conflict within Jerusalem's sacred walls. David knew that if he stayed, the battle between his forces and Absalom's could destroy the city he loved so dearly. David's flight was marked by sadness and humiliation. He crossed the Kidron Valley barefoot and with his head covered in mourning. Those still loyal to him followed his example, expressing their pain and loyalty. As David and his followers climbed the Mount of Olives, the despair was palpable. It wasn't just the loss of the throne that weighed on David, but the betrayal of his own son, which made the situation unbearable. During his flight, David encountered several figures who represented different responses to his fall. Some, like Zadok the priest and his sons, remained loyal and offered David spiritual support. Zadok even brought the Ark of the Covenant to accompany David in his flight, but the king refused, saying that if it was God's will, he would return to Jerusalem and see the Ark again. This moment demonstrated David's deep faith, even in the midst of the crisis. He knew that his fate was in God's hands, not those of men. On the other hand, David also faced those who rejoiced in his fall. Shimei, a member of Saul's household, met David and insulted him, throwing stones and curses at the king. Even though his men urged him to punish Shimei, David chose to accept the abuse, believing that, in some way, this humiliation was part of God's plan for him. In his humility, David showed that even in exile, he still trusted completely in divine justice. As David distanced himself from Jerusalem, he began to plan his return. He sent friends like Hushai back to the city to act as spies and sabotage Absalom's counsel. David knew that although he was temporarily defeated, there was still a chance to reclaim the throne. His strategic mind remained active, even as his heart suffered from the pain of betrayal. Absalom, meanwhile, took advantage of his control over Jerusalem. He entered the city arrogantly, believing that he had finally achieved what he always desired. However, Absalom's rebellion was far from resolved. He underestimated David's resilience and the support the king still had among the loyalists. Now, Israel's fate depended on the battle that was approaching. Father and son, once united, were now on opposite sides of a civil war that would shake the nation. David, the exiled king, and Absalom, the crowned rebel, were destined for a final confrontation that would decide not only the future of the throne, but also the fate of their souls. The decisive battle between David's and Absalom's forces was fought in the dark forest of Ephraim, a place that would become the stage for a tragic fate. Confident of his imminent victory, Absalom gathered his troops and prepared to definitively defeat his father. However, he underestimated both David's experience and the treacherous terrain of the forest. Absalom's confidence quickly turned into recklessness, and it would come at a high price. David, with all his experience as a military strategist, knew that the battle would be won not only by the strength of arms but by knowledge of the terrain. He divided his troops into 3 parts, led by his generals Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, and gave an explicit order: "Deal gently with Absalom for my sake." Although David was at war with his son, his father's heart still longed to spare Absalom from death. However, Joab, David's ruthless general, had already decided that Absalom would receive no mercy. When the battle began, Absalom's army was quickly disoriented by the dense and confusing terrain of the forest. What should have been an easy victory for him soon turned into a disaster. The trees and ravines of the forest of Ephraim became deadly traps for Absalom's soldiers. Many fell not by the sword, but by the unforgiving conditions of the terrain. The battle turned into a chaotic hunt, and David's seasoned and disciplined forces prevailed. Amid the chaos, Absalom, riding on his mule, tried to flee, but fate had other plans. As he rode between the trees, Absalom's long hair, his symbol of pride and beauty, became tangled in the branches of an oak tree. He was left hanging, suspended between heaven and earth, unable to free himself. His mule continued on, leaving him vulnerable and at the mercy of his enemies. It was then that Joab, upon learning of Absalom's whereabouts, decided to act. Ignoring David's orders, he took 3 darts and thrust them into Absalom's heart while he was still hanging in the tree. His soldiers then surrounded him and killed him, sealing the young rebel's fate. To Joab, this was the only way to ensure that the rebellion was extinguished once and for all. To David, however, this would be a devastating loss. With Absalom's death, the rebellion came to an end. Absalom's troops, now leaderless, quickly scattered. David's victory was assured, but the cost was terrible. The man he loved so dearly, his own son, was now dead, and there was nothing he could do to change that. News of Absalom's death would soon reach David, and what should have been a moment of military triumph turned into a personal tragedy. The battle in the forest of Ephraim wasn't just the end of a rebellion. It was the end of a relationship between father and son that, for all its turmoil, was still marked by love. Absalom's death, hanging between heaven and earth, was a powerful symbol of his life and choices. Absalom, who always aspired to the throne and power, was left suspended, unable to reach either the glory he sought or his father's forgiveness. When Joab and his men took his life, they didn't just kill the rebel. They ended one of the Bible's most tragic stories. Absalom, the son who rebelled against his father, paid the ultimate price for his ambition. When news of Absalom's death reached David, the pain he felt was overwhelming. Though a warrior hardened by years of battle, nothing could prepare him for the agony of losing a son, especially in the manner it happened. David didn't see Absalom as the rebel who tried to usurp the throne. He saw him as the boy he had held in his arms, the young man full of promise and hope who could one day have been his successor. Upon hearing the news, David cried out in anguish, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." These words echoed through the palace corridors and in the hearts of those who heard. David's pain wasn't just the pain of a father. It was the pain of a king who knew that his family had been destroyed by his son's own thirst for power. David, who had won so many victories, felt that this was the most devastating defeat of his life. The tragic irony of Absalom's death is that even in his rebellion, he sought something that was already his by right: his father's love and attention. David always loved Absalom, but the events that unfolded between them, from the incident with Tamar to the rebellion, drove father and son apart in an irreparable way. Absalom's ambition led him to seek the throne, but in the end, he lost everything: his kingdom, his father, and his own life. As Absalom's body was buried in an unceremonious grave, David remained in his deep mourning. He couldn't rejoice in the victory his men had won. To him, the price was too high. The king who had fled his throne to avoid the destruction of his city now found himself destroyed from within. David had not only lost a son, but also the chance at the redemption he so desired between them. Absalom's tragedy wasn't just a matter of power or politics. It was the story of a young man who lost himself in his own ambition and a father who couldn't save him. What remained was the void left by Absalom's absence and the pain that would accompany David for the rest of his days. Though Absalom sought greatness, he ended suspended between heaven and earth, never reaching either. The story of Absalom left a deep mark on Israel, not only because of the battles fought, but also because of the bitter lessons his rebellion brought. Absalom's legacy is, in many ways, a tragic reminder of what happens when pride, ambition, and unforgiveness rule someone's heart. His life, which began with so much potential, ended in catastrophe, not just for him but for the entire nation. One of the greatest lessons we can learn from Absalom is the danger of unresolved bitterness. From the incident with Tamar, Absalom harbored a silent fury in his heart that turned into rebellion. He could never forgive his father for failing to act against Amnon, and this resentment consumed him. His inability to deal with the pain in a healthy way led him to seek vengeance, not only against Amnon but eventually against David himself. In the end, this bitterness drove him away from his family and led him down a path of destruction. Another important lesson is the issue of unchecked ambition. Absalom wanted power, and he was willing to do anything to obtain it, even betraying his father. However, he wasn't prepared for the responsibilities and sacrifices that power demanded. Absalom underestimated the depth of loyalty David still had among his people and the weight of bearing Israel's crown. Absalom's desire for control and glory blinded him to the realities of leadership, and he paid the price for that recklessness. Absalom's tragedy also reminds us of the complexity of family relationships. The relationship between David and Absalom was destroyed by a series of misunderstandings, communication failures, and, above all, the absence of forgiveness. David, though a wise and experienced king, failed to address the crisis within his own household. His inaction regarding the injustice done to Tamar created a rift that was never fully healed. On the other hand, Absalom never directly expressed his frustrations to his father. Had there been true reconciliation between them, perhaps the story would have taken a different course. The tragic end of Absalom also reveals the deceptive nature of pride. Absalom believed he could challenge David and win, but he underestimated his father's wisdom and experience. David, even in exile and outnumbered, managed to overcome Absalom's rebellion through strategy and faith. Absalom's pride, symbolized by his famous hair that ultimately led to his downfall, shows that relying solely on oneself, without humility, can lead to a fall. Finally, Absalom's story is a warning about the consequences of leadership actions. David, despite his greatness, had failures as a father, and these failures contributed to Absalom's rebellion. Leaders, whether in the family, church, or any other sphere, need to be attentive to the needs of those under their care. David neglected the signs of bitterness in Absalom, and this led to a tragedy that could have been avoided. In the end, Absalom's story is a powerful warning to us all. It reminds us of the importance of forgiveness, the need to address our wounds before they consume us, and the dangers of pride and unchecked ambition. Above all, it shows us that while we may plan our own paths, there are always consequences beyond our control. Absalom's story is more than just a narrative of betrayal and power. It is a lesson about the choices we make and the consequences they bring. Absalom, a prince full of potential, let resentment and ambition consume him, leading him down a path of destruction. His life, which began with great promise, ended tragically, caught between heaven and earth, symbolizing his failure to achieve any of his goals. For David, the victory over Absalom didn't bring joy, but pain. He had won the battle but lost his son. This story reminds us that no matter how much we pursue power, success, or justice, the price to be paid may be too high. Absalom sought something he already had, his father's love, but ended up losing everything by trying to take what wasn't his. May we learn from Absalom's tragedy. May we not let bitterness grow in our hearts. And may we always seek reconciliation and forgiveness before it's too late. Just as David wept for his son, God calls us back, even when we stray. Don't wait until it's too late to seek the forgiveness and peace that only He can offer. If this story touched your heart, share your reflection and prayer in the comments. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss the upcoming biblical stories that bring profound lessons for our lives today. Now, prepare to receive a special blessing. Lord, just as David wept for his son, so too do you weep for us when we stray from you. Help us to recognize our mistakes, seek reconciliation, and walk humbly before you. May we never let pride or bitterness take us away from your love. In Jesus' name, amen.